Good evening, everybody. I am Norbert de Costa, President of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. I speak to you from Brampton, Ontario, a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Brampton is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. World Federalists view the whole world in a similar way, as one society, embracing all of humanity in all its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Immediately following this featured event, approximately an hour from now, World Federalists will remain on this Zoom meeting to answer any questions the audience may have regarding world federalism, the World Federalist Movement, and to announce Toronto branches upcoming event you may be interested in. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce the third lecture in our series on issues that can only be fully and effectively addressed by good global governance. Issues such as climate change, war and peace, international economics, migration, and equity and social justice for all of the human race. Today's speaker is Christine Peringer, and the topic is Better Climate Governance, How to Improve Climate Negotiations. First, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a chat button, which you can use to chat with everyone on the meeting or with facilitators. You will also use the chat feature to submit your questions. We request that chats be respectful of all others attending. This meeting is recorded. We will send the link to the recording to all registrants in the next day or two. Here to introduce and welcome Christine Peringer is Fergus Watt, until recently the National Executive Director of the World Federalist Movement.
Thanks a lot. I'm tempted to ask Norbert how much time I have, because I've known Christine for a long time, but I won't. Christine and I first met, I think, in the early 80s. She was working at an outfit called the Peace Research Institute, Dundas, and working for the Newcombs. Hannah Newcomb was twice president of the World Federalists and a really iconic figure in Canadian history, but especially the peace movement. And Christine at the time was fresh out of law school, but still trying to figure out how the world worked and what to make of international law, and was enough of an idealist that she didn't want to just do that from the cozy confines of some Bay Street law office. So, and at that time, I was just sort of kicking around as a volunteer for the World Federalists, but we were both busy because there was a broad-based popular peace movement at the time in the 1980s, and it was framed. Most people were active and agitated mostly around issues of disarmament. This was during the time of the Ronald Reagan arms buildup and the Cold War, and Canada was doing its bit, testing cruise missiles and so on. Christine and I also collaborated, later in the decade of the 80s through a couple of Canadian elections. We worked on Election Priorities Project, was the name of it, and this was an attempt to bring together civil society organizations working on peace issues together with environmental NGOs and development NGOs, which was, it seems like common sense as we look back on it, but it was kind of avant-garde, and not all of our peacenik colleagues, bought in at that time. But Christine also, after some of those projects, worked for an outfit called 5 Days for Development and Peace, which was an effort to promote humanitarian ceasefires. So once again, bringing peace into conjunction with development to further human security. And then her career detoured into a very successful consulting effort that around small group facilitation, training, communications, and mediation. So once again, the peace component, and Christine is someone who's perpetually curious and inquisitive, and also very empathetic. And so you can see why a consultancy in group facilitation and mediation would be successful for someone with those skills. And then if we could fast forward to as the world changed, of course, there were a growing number of global issues that required the attention of advocates of better global governance. And all this time, Christine and I were both active in the World Federalist Movement. Christine's been a long-time member, and so if we fast forward to the time when just recently, I don't know how many years ago now, but not that many, Christine attended one of the conference of the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change on behalf of a group called Mediators Beyond Borders. So her interests were starting to veer toward applying her mediation skills to global governance, and she observed the conference of the parties and the way that an international negotiation around these incremental improvements to the climate governance regime, which is the Paris Treaty is a subsidiary treaty from this framework convention, which is, just as it sounds, an international law framework for how governments are going to deal with climate change. And so she observed some of the goings on there, and I'm sure she'll report just how puzzled and aghast and other, she was, and I think there's a good degree of skepticism that World Federalists bring to the climate, and many activists, not just World Federalists, to the climate discussions. I mean, the way the world goes about dealing with climate change is that within the Paris Agreement, there's an agreement on a global goal, a target of how we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but then we leave it up to individual national governments to determine their share, and with very little in the way of remedial action when they don't do their share, and hence we have but that's it's easy to criticize the climate regime, but it's harder to do something about it. And so after her first round of visiting and observing the climate discussions, she got more involved, and the result was a partnership with colleagues at Newcastle University in the UK on this Better Climate Governance project. And thankfully for the World Federalists, the funding for this project required was meant to involve civil society as well as academia, and so we were happy to be the civil society counterparty to this project on better climate governance, and you know, climate governance is a big topic, and the work that Christine has and Catherine Reidig have undertaken is dedicated to the actual on intergovernmental processes primarily, but there's many dimensions of climate governance, and just I mean, I don't think Christine's going to talk about this, but you know, there was an important development just last week at the Human Rights Council at the UN, where they managed to get agreement on a special rapporteur for human rights and climate. So, which means that the special rapporteur is someone who's going to, within the system, who's going to be empowered to talk about how the behavior of governments is not consistent with human rights norms, and how their actions to follow up their commitments, whether in Paris or their human rights commitments, can be improved. So this is just one more advocate within a very, let's face it, a very fragmented system of global governance. And so what we're going to hear tonight is you know, a world federalist, but someone who is very realistic and working within the system and recognizing how, you know, how the system works, and then looking at how we can improve it. So this should be good fun, and I think I'll stop there. I mentioned you know, the Christine's curious and inquisitive qualities, but she's, you know, and sometimes, you know, when you talk to Christine, you know, there's a sense that, oh, we really don't know everything, and but trust me, she knows a lot, so it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to my great friend, Christine Peringer.
Thank you, Fergus. Walter, I don't know if you were going to say something as well, or should I now? Is Walter Dorn
Go
here?
ahead, Chris.
Yes, hi. It's Norbert. You let me know what you want. I do have a few things to say about Christine, but I'd be happy to.
No, go ahead, Walter. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, many of you know what it's like to meet someone and not be in touch for a long time, like 2.5 or so decades, and then rediscover them. And it was in this case where I'm delighted to come to Christine's talk. And I, even though we met in the late 1980s, I considered her a friend when we were both writing books at the Peace Research Institute Dundas. And Christine is someone who's very passionate, and as she likes to say, I've seen her in her writings, passionate about people saving or serving the world. And in this case, she's literally taken up the cause of saving the world. So it's great that she's working on this global issue of climate change and what to do about it. And with the COP coming up in Glasgow, we'll see how much of her advice the governments will wisely take. And this talk will be able to get a little bit of that wise advice from her directly. So yeah, I really welcome you to coming to World Federalist. As president of the organization, I give you a very warm welcome, Christine, and we look forward to your insights.
Thanks, Walter, and thanks very much, Fergus. Well, I'm really looking forward to sharing what I have to share tonight. I want to share a little bit of detail about what I know and what I don't know, just to make a framework. And do that, I'm just going to go a little bit into how I got involved in the Better Climate Governance project. Just as Fergus said, it was in June 2019 that I first went to observe the climate change negotiations, which were taking place in Bonn, Germany. You're probably aware that every November or December, there's something called the Conference of the Parties, and that moves around the world. And this year it's in Glasgow in just a couple of weeks. Last year, well, it was supposed to have been in Chile, but the transit strikes there at the very last moment, it got moved to Madrid. And so it moves around to major cities around the world. And then in June each year, always in Bonn, which is where the UN Framework on Climate Change Secretariat is located, they have a set of negotiations aren't accompanied with by the hoopla of the Conference of the Parties. Conference of the Parties are all over the CBC right now, that they're coming up. My husband just told me that Prince William is going. It's prime ministers, heads of state. It's been called a circus, a climate circus, as well as negotiations. Serious negotiations are going on. In Bonn in June, it's just the negotiation process. Although there still are observers, it isn't the same level of the kind of climate trade show that the Conference of the Parties is. So when I went in June 2019 as a member, as Fergus said, of the Mediators Beyond Borders International Observer Delegation, that was my first experience ever of sitting and watching negotiations take place. I had an intern at the UN in the Department for Disarmament Affairs. I'd been gone to New York several times to lead different causes at different events, some with World Federalists and others with Voice of Women and other Canadian groups. This was my first time ever seeing negotiations take place. And as Fergus said, I was really appalled. And the things that I saw, I noted. I ended up taking a lot of notes just verbatim of how the conversations were going, and ended up developing a kind of a list of things that had I been chairing those meetings that I would have done differently. And I spoke with other members of the delegation, some of whom had been going for 10 or more years. And their reaction was, that's just the way this goes, Christine. You have to understand, with international things, that's just the way it goes. And then through one of them, I met a professor from Newcastle University, Catherine Rettig, that Fergus mentioned, who is German by birth, and in fact through COVID has been in Germany, but she's actually an associate professor at Newcastle University. And I started talking to her about negotiations and found her to be, she's a lecturer on, a political science lecturer, and with a special focus on the UN and on climate change. And she was really just a font of information, and I learned a lot talking to her. And then I shared some of my ideas, and her reaction was, this is so interesting. I've never heard a professional facilitator's view on how this process is run by the UN. You should write something about this. And I said, oh, I've got a law degree, but I'm not an academic, and I would need a lot more background before I felt comfortable doing any writing or research. And she said, well, then maybe we should do something together. And that was the beginning of the Better Climate Governance Project. And then she was successful in attracting a bit of funding for it that World Federalists was gracious enough to be willing to be the agency that allowed that funding to flow to me. And that project was to do a series of briefing papers and an academic paper and some kind of a dissemination event. And I will share at the end of my presentation in a moment the website where you can go and look at all this information. And there you'll find 6 policy briefs that go into more detail than I'm going to tonight about what our recommendations are. And also you'll find the report of our dissemination event, which was a conference in April of this year. We had about 100 people in attendance, a great mix of academics and negotiators and others who are civil society and others who are interested in improving the negotiation process. And we are currently working on the academic paper, and that will be done in the next month or so, I think. And so that's just the big picture. So what you'll have picked up from that is that I'm not a climate expert, and Fergus knows more than I do about all the other pieces that are part of that. Call it a mosaic makes it sound more intentional, because mosaics are usually intentional, but bits and pieces that all relate to climate throughout the UN system. So I wonder if there are any questions right off the top, or whether I should just jump into my presentation. I can't see everybody's screen, and so I don't know.
If there are any questions, I'll relay them to you, Christine.
Okay, excellent. So why don't I start sharing my screen then, and start sharing what, here we go.
You see it.
Received? Okay, good, thank you. So, whoops, how did that happen? Okay, I'll start here. So it's a little bit about challenge. There's a lab in Hawaii since 1958 has been measuring carbon emissions, or the presence of atmospheric carbon in atmosphere. And it's called, the scientist that started it is Charles David Keeling, and what he created is now called the Keeling curve. So you'll be able to see the bad news of this, and carbon is only one of the greenhouse gases, but you can see the steady rise, and even with COVID, the actual amount ever measured peaked in May this year, which is the highest level in the 63 years of measuring this. So even with a global shutdown, we are still producing highest ever CO2 emissions. So that's a graphic just to present the challenge. The response has been the world focusing on this. And in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence. It was one of 3 of the Rio Conventions, along with the Biodiversity Convention and the Convention on Desertification. And it now has almost universal ratification, membership ratification. I think there's 197 countries who have signed on to it. And then there was a number of accords and agreements since then. The convention itself, the most significant part was it labeled for the first time in an internationally approved document that there's a goal to prevent, they called it dangerous human interference with the climate system. And then agreements since have developed, and each in place another aspect of the framework convention process. The Kyoto Accord in 1997, Paris Agreement in 2015. And what's been created through this is a whole system of finance, of monitoring and verification, and goal setting, and a process where countries have agreed to create what they call NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions to the meeting of the goal of keeping the climate change at a level of 2 degrees, an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, or in relation to, I think it's 1990 levels. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, some agreed upon benchmark, and then and if possible, keep it to 1.5, because even at 1.5, there are very significant impacts on climate, which we're already seeing in the world today. So I, as I said, I went to the Bonn 2019 negotiations, and these are just some pictures that accompanied that. You can see they meet in many different formats, but an open cube is one of them. And so you can see that in the middle. Have a gorgeous building that's used for other events throughout. I think they rent it for other events, but this is where the regular climate change negotiations take place every June. And I just added a picture of my colleague, Catherine Rettig, here, because she's going to be, she's as much a part of this project. And if she hadn't been asleep, she would have been on this call too. But as she's in Germany, it's well past her comfortable participation time. So when I was there, this was another meeting room. This was a meeting room called Nairobi. All the rooms have the name of a different world capital. And so this was the room where they were negotiating carbon markets. That's still to be determined, how they can have a transparent system where, without double counting, that would allow carbon saved in some countries to be bought and sold by other countries in order to keep the global level down, but allow distribution of the activity on it. And so these are contentious discussions that are going on. And but what I saw with my facilitator lens is unanimous decision making. They have agreed. Well, they actually haven't agreed on their rules of procedure, but they have a working agreement that they will use consensus to make decisions. And while they say they are operating by consensus, it's not a consensus style that I was familiar with, and I use consensus decision making frequently in the meetings that I run. And what they were doing, and I'll give you more information about this in a bit, but they were requiring unanimity in the room rather than consensus. I saw a real lack of urgency. It was interesting. Outside these windows, on one of the days of negotiation, there was a huge Fridays for Future protest. So while we were sitting in these rooms, going slowly, hearing everybody speak on whether a comma should be here or there, outside, it felt like the world was calling for a better way to make progress so that it could be faster and actually have the impact that is needed to make things better for current and future generations. The chairing style was minimal. There were some exceptions, but for the most part, the chair mostly kept a speakers list, but otherwise didn't do any of the things that I normally do when I'm facilitating a meeting in terms of reframing the discussion and helping identify the specific areas that need decision and guiding the group through a process to help them do that as efficiently as possible. And they had small group processes, but they were ad hoc, would happen in the corners of the rooms or leaning over desks. And if you look at this assembly, it would be very hard to do any kind of meaningful small group process where you would gather the people to give a reasoned think through of how to move forward on any particular item. And I was talking to somebody who's actually very senior in the UNFCCC Secretariat, and I said I was so surprised at how these negotiations are run. And I said I found them medieval, and not knowing if he would take offense. And his response was, yes, they are mediocre and evil. And I was just delighted when he said that, because it really summed up how I was feeling by what I had seen. So the Better Climate Governance Project has created what we're calling our toolkit, and I know you won't be able to read these, but these are the 10 items that we are advocating for change. And I'll just go through them in general and then with one in more specific, and then we'll open up for questions. The toolkit is divided into two sections, and the first is recommendations for presiding officers. These are things that could be carried out by the people who are chairing the meetings. Those people are negotiators. They have been chosen by the chair of the overall meeting. And they change over time, and there's always one developed country and one developing country, and yeah, that's the diversity that they're trying to get in those presiding officers. So our recommendations are that there would be 5 changes. First is an interpretation of consensus that distinguishes it from unanimity, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Reminders of the urgency and goal of the negotiations. I've just alluded to that. Small group processes that build consensus on divisive issues. The use of straw votes, or there would have to be some other name, but to assist chairs and negotiators to understand quickly where they are on the path to consensus. So by a straw vote, I just mean a show of hands or other indication to see where, if people are agreeing with something that has been proposed, not in any way to show that indicate that there's a decision on that, but rather just to reflect back to that whole room where they are on it. Because now they have a very deliberate but slow process where any of the 197 countries there can speak to something. And while they are organized into groups, they're organized into a group. Like Canada is part of the umbrella group, and the umbrella group includes the US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, a few other countries that aren't aligned with any other group. The European Union is a group. The Association of Small Island States is another group. There's different groups, and often someone will speak and say, like, I'm Norbert Costa, and I am speaking now representing the umbrella group. And so the negotiators will flag when they're speaking for everybody. But quite often, other members of that group will also speak, and not saying things that are very different, but rather because they just want to be on the record as having spoken on this issue. So I was imagining that there must be systems where people could quickly indicate, and you could get all 197 on something and then be able to move forward more quickly. And then finally, pairing best practices like use of really focused questions, restating to see, is everybody, this is what I'm hearing as being supported by everybody who's spoken so far, summarizing where the discussions have come from, where they're going. And I think that would also help. These are all things that professional facilitators do all the time. And I've kind of joked that if I ran my meetings the way the UNFCCC runs their meetings, that I would not have a consulting practice because nobody would be hiring me. It's so inefficient. And it just feels tragic to me that the most important conversation on the planet is being run in this way that we would never tolerate in any other more local forum. So I'm just going to speak a moment about consensus and unanimity. It's so interesting to me that consensus is a very popularly used decision-making process within the UN. Many UN General Assembly decisions are made by consensus, and many other bodies have consensus decision-making. That's not the surprising part. I think it's a very good way to make decisions in some situations. But the surprising thing to me was that nowhere is it definitively defined what consensus is. I kept thinking I was going to find it somewhere, and I spoke with many different people, including the Dag Hammarskjöld librarian, also negotiators, also other people who are closer in the Secretariat, and it is not defined anywhere. Within the Guide for Presiding Officers for the UNFCCC, they have a whole boxed section on it sharing different views of what it might be and how it's interpreted in some contexts, but nothing saying what it definitely is in this context. But what everyone seems to agree is that consensus means that, well, the way it's often defined is consensus means you haven't gone to a vote. That's the way it is in the General Assembly. A decision without a vote, an affirmative decision without a vote, is a decision by consensus. That's a definition based on what it isn't rather than what it actually is. And there's specific aspects to consensus that are really important that I think would be a very helpful addition to the UNFCCC process. And one of those is that consensus, they do say that consensus exists when it is recognized by the presiding officers. So there has actually been a case, and it happened in Cancun, at the COP there in, I think that was 2016, where there was actually Bolivia was actually vociferously objecting to a decision, and actually left his seat and the negotiator and walked in front and was trying to get the chair's attention. And she said, I believe we have consensus. And then there's video showing him complaining, and she looks right past him and brings down the gavel and said, passed, agreed. And at that point, in what some are saying was a well-orchestrated event, there was applause erupted in the room. And much was written of this afterwards, mostly in support of what she had done, because she, this was Patricia Espinosa, who went on to become the head of the UNFCCC Secretariat, but at this point was foreign minister for Mexico and chair of the COP. And she had done so much work in the lead up to that event, had met repeatedly with all the different delegations, had many discussions. The Bolivian delegation had expressed itself fully in the smaller subsidiary meetings leading up to the final plenary, and they were alone in their opposition to the agreement that was emerging at that event. So in a lot of different academic articles, they point to that as being a very good decision on her part. And that just does not fit in my view of what good process is. And I just think it would be too easy for that kind of chair blindness to be used in a way that was not for the good of the whole, as was most believed in that room. But also, it doesn't breed faith and respect in the process. And I think what is missing here is a particular part of consensus, which is called standing aside. And standing aside means you don't support what is happening, but you will allow the usually vast majority that feel differently from you to make that decision, but you will stand and you will say your objection in the strongest way you can. But as long as the chair will ask, do you feel you have been heard and understood and considered in coming to this decision? And they will say yes, if that is the case, and if not, that needs to be remedied in some way. And then the chair would say, are you willing to stand aside? Or is your objection so strong that you feel you need to block the progress on this that is supported by 196 other nations? And I think if given that platform, that Bolivia might have responded differently. Now, if a country is determined to be obstructionist, then no matter what process you're going to use, as long as it isn't just a vote, then this solution will not make a difference in terms of making that allowing the vast majority to go forward. I think there's probably many cases where people just need to be seen to be making the strongest possible objection, short of blocking everybody, being seen as the one to block everybody. And I think that was the case in Bolivia, I was talking with Bolivia. I was talking to a negotiator who was sitting right behind Bolivia, and at that meeting, and she said that that. Oh, and it was interesting that the reason why Bolivia was objecting was that the agreement wasn't strong enough. It wasn't that Bolivia was trying to prevent things from going in this direction. It's more they wanted to go further. And this negotiator that I spoke with had spoken with him and really felt that it was very important for him to be taking that strong position because of the audience back home in Bolivia that had said that we needed to have faster progress on climate change than this group was being considered for this COP, that meeting, that COP. So that's the piece that I am in the process of trying to explore. How could this change? Is it something that could be adopted? And so far, we have just made it in the form of the proposal in our the proposals as in the presentation that we made in April at our dissemination event, and then through our website. But I'm quite keen to keep trying to get closer and closer to the people who are making decisions about how the process goes, just to have a conversation about, has this been considered? What about adding some words into the presiding officer's guide in order to give more direction on this? Because I think it would really build trust in the process and potentially speed things up. So the last 5 items, these are recommendations for the UNFCCC Bureau and Secretariat to make. So these aren't things within the control of a presiding officer, any of the chairs, but UNFCCC Bureau is a representative agency representing the parties to the agreement, and they make decisions about process, and the Secretariat has a lot of power in how the process is carried out. And so for those recommendations would be to make better use of content experts. It was really interesting watching the carbon market negotiations, and I don't know for sure, but my sense was that a number of the negotiators were out of their depth in terms of understanding the subject. Not that I could tell because I was an expert, but more because of the interplay back and forth. It seemed that some knew an awful lot more, and I thought it could have. And at times they were stuck about, well, how can we make a mechanism more transparent and meet the objection of Argentina? And I just thought it would have been so useful at that moment if they could have had experts who could, even within a session, identify the 4 different ways that the transparency mechanism could be improved to meet an objection that had been raised, and keep them out of the discussion of which was the best or which should be chosen, but rather just give options. Facilitation experts to support parties in exploring issues and developing consensus. It's fairly common throughout the whole UN system that these are party-driven events. But have neutral facilitators, I think, would be very helpful. All kinds of things can affect you as chair, and I've heard chairs in other processes say that there can be real negative blowback if you chair a meeting and you don't give extra time or rule on iffy things, rule in favor of your nation's voting bloc or negotiation bloc, and I think it would be very interesting to know, have they considered bringing in external facilitators? And it would have to be from some pool that had been identified and approved by the UNFCCC Bureau. But I think it would really improve the quality of their work and their small group work. They were very chaotic how they did small groups, and if they could have a whole bunch of facilitators spread out and assisting those groups and keeping speakers lists and making sure that all voices had been heard, I think they would come up with better decisions faster. Better use of mutual learning. Negotiators are so siloed. They have very long negotiation days, and it is so much work to stay on top of developments in their particular negotiation, and and staying in touch with their teams about what's happening in other rooms at the same time that they need to confer upon. But between negotiators, between countries, there could be such useful exchanges of information that we think that there are ways that there could be more mutual learning. And then also with non-national actors, meaning the civil society observers who have so much information and more chance for interaction between them. They have some processes that do allow that. There's something called the ACE dialogues, Action on Climate Empowerment. It's a relatively new process, and if I were a negotiator, I don't think I would have gone to it. So it needs some work. Then institutional memory on negotiation and facilitation techniques. That's for the presiding officers, the facilitation techniques, and then institutional memory on negotiation for within negotiating parties, and also that could be shared. And then non-negotiation settings to explore common ground, more ways to bring negotiators together when they're not just hammering out a text, to develop the common ground that is needed for us to move forward. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Here's a picture of my kids from a couple years ago. And I guess they're a big part of why I am so keen to improve the climate change negotiation for them and their kids. I'd love to hear if there's any ideas to share or any questions. Norbert, you're muted right now.
Thanks. Yes, I was. So I'll start by asking a question myself, Christine. Most mature seminars and annual meetings, for example, from mature organizations have a survey at the end where people provide feedback. So COP being an annual thing, do they not have a survey where people can provide input and they'll have continuous improvement?
That is a great question, and I have never seen reference to it anywhere. And I think even like that one piece in a larger evaluation of the whole process, I think would be so valuable. I mean, I'm just throwing in 10 ideas here, but if they did a complete brought in evaluators, it would have, and I don't even know, and I'd look some of you to know, have evaluations been done of any other of the processes like Law of the Sea or others in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, equity, the kinds of things that you might care about in wanting to know if a process was effective. But no, don't do that.
Thanks, Christine.
Yeah. On the idea of consensus, if you take that definition that consensus is when a decision is taken without a vote, I mean, that would be true in cases where there's a dictator there. I remember reading years ago about a meeting of the Spanish cabinet when Franco was dictator of Spain, and it said, well, there's no vote is taken. There's only one vote that matters. It's Franco's. So, you know, in that situation, the dictator, well, presumably the people who were there and the other cabinet members say could say something, but once Franco had decided on the issue, that was it. You know, now I guess we're not dealing with a similar situation at the climate negotiations, but how do you get oil producers such as Saudi Arabia and small island states which are low-lying and are going to go underwater the way things are headed, such as the Maldives? How do you get agreement between the two? And it doesn't have to be, you know, one state against another one, because there's a group of oil exporters who are relying on the money they're making from producing and exporting oil, and there's a group of, you know, small island states which are going to go underwater or lose a lot of their land.
So I think, Jeffrey, you're saying that though there is divergence of interest, for example, the oil producers on the one side, and you have got the islands like Tuvalu on the other side that are threatened by climate. So how do you get consensus when you have a situation such as that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. They have gotten consensus. They've created the framework, they've created a target, they've created a system. Saudi Arabia is one of the is hugely investing in green energy right now. I could imagine that they'd be one of the best situated to do solar, and so they have gotten agreement. Now you could ask, would they ever, like, will they agree to a point, as long as they don't look too much like the global bad guy, but not such a point that they would have to do something that really was against their interests. But countries now, they've all agreed to create a system where they report on their NDCs, and they are committing to a certain level of reduction of emissions, and most are agreeing towards a zero by 2050. So they are agreeing. It's in nobody's best interest to live in a world that is uninhabitable. So I think that's where that's the optimistic view of why they will agree and are agreeing, have agreed so far.
Question from John: how often are votes called, and are votes one country, one vote, as in the UN?
Yeah, no voting at all at UNFCCC. That's the rules of procedure. You can look them up. They outline a procedure like the UN General Assembly, where it's one nation, one vote, but that was never passed. And so there are no official rules of procedure for this process, which has been going on for, well, it'll be 30 years next year. They have agreed, they have what they call a working agreement to operate by consensus. And within the consensus process, it's one block consensus possible per party.
Okay, thank you. Question from Peter. Could you elaborate on what climate empowerment involves? Can you elaborate on what climate empowerment
yeah.
involves?
So they have this thing called ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment. And what it is I'm just forgetting which article of the Paris Convention it is, maybe 5, I'd have to look it up. There's one article that specifies how important engaging the population of the entire world in the challenge of both reducing emissions and adapting to the climate changes that are going to be coming. And so they call it Action on Climate Empowerment. And it's they have dialogues around the world that citizens can just join in, and they're working out the sharing of information about, like, in school systems, like a curriculum, all the different ways in all different parts of society where education around climate change could be increased. So that's what that is.
Got a question of Rose Dyson. It must be a gargantuan task to get consensus between 197 countries. And what you describe as the preliminary process is very interesting to someone not familiar with your techniques. But what steps were used to reach the Paris Accord in 2015? That is beyond what you advocate.
What was there was a lot of very good preparatory work. My project is really just looking at the process within the room, and most academic work looking at consensus is all about how do you build a consensus, and that consensus is built by the chair of the COP working very hard with other players to move forward on specific agenda items, so that when they gather, they can move more quickly, that they're not starting from the same spot they were in the previous year when they left the COP. So the Paris Accord is largely credited to Macron, who was the prime minister, French prime minister, but also who was actually the person sitting, but also this Patricia Espinosa, who was the chair of the secretariat and who worked very hard in order to get the idea of setting that target of 2 degrees Celsius established in that agreement. So that seems to be the most common opinion, that the way decisions do happen is by a lot of work in the time leading up to the negotiations.
Question from Keith McNeil. How aware are the people at UNFCCC of your work, and what sort of reception have you received?
Well, great reception of specific negotiators and other academics. And I've had and except for that one very senior person who was off the record, I have not had contact with the UNFCCC. I'm in the process of working through a negotiator that I know who has contacts who have other negotiators who are on or have just left the UNFCCC bureau. So I'm just working away at that, and I'm attending the meeting in Glasgow in 2 weeks, and I'm going to be that's the main contact that I'm going to be looking for while I'm there. I'll have my list of who those members are, and then if I see opportunities to, if I see opportunities to talk with those people, I will. It's a very interesting process when you're there as an observer, because you have access to the negotiations, but also you're all in the same corridors afterwards, and people are regularly approaching other people, introducing themselves, and the person can just say, I don't have time to talk now, but here's my card, give me a call later. It's a very good way to, I found, to establish links with people that otherwise you might never get a return email if you weren't able to say, we met in Glasgow, and you encourage me to be in touch with you about X, and then that allows those conversations to move forward.
Question from Walter Dorn. How is the 2015 Paris Climate Accord verified and enforced? Does the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have a role?
No, the IPCC is completely separate. They are scientists who are just focused on the state of the climate and not at all on the mechanisms or process or anything. And I have your question written down here. That was a part of it. Oh, how is it verified? Well, that's what they're still, it seems to be, and this is a question that I'm holding to, Walter. So as far as I can understand it, is countries, there's a schedule of when each country needs to submit their nationally determined contributions, and then there's a schedule of reporting in relation to it. But what I don't know, and I'm looking forward to finding out, is how do you challenge what somebody else has said about their own evaluation of where they are towards meeting their own goals? Or I haven't heard of some independent verification body who is monitoring what countries say in relation to other evidence. Now, a whole bunch of nonprofits are doing that. There are a number of different places, like you can even go online and see that, like something like if all the the nationally determined contributions are all put together, it advances us something like 17% towards the goal of where we need to get to in order to have meet the goals of zero emissions by 2050. So there are people doing that independent work. I don't know. I can't answer that question right off. And there's certainly no enforcement, but even observation of it and holding it some universal standard, I don't know that. And there must be something, but I haven't heard.
I've got a variation on John Cohen's question. May 15th, Elspeth May spoke to our group in this series, and she referred to the Montreal Protocol, which was highly effective because there was the trade element behind it. So countries could be penalized if they did not follow those the protocol. And that was dissolved subsequent to the Montreal Protocol. So without that enforcement mechanism, what hope is there for COP26? Even if you improve procedures of discussions.
Yeah, well, I have no problem admitting that my procedure, this is not solution to the whole thing. This is just a piece within my area of expertise. And I was listening to that presentation that Elizabeth May gave, and I noted that, and I thought, isn't that interesting? I haven't heard that said, and I wonder if there's some reason why that doesn't apply in this situation. I'm not sure, but that whole question of mechanisms to I'm just looking for the right word, but certainly to flag when countries are not meeting their own standards. And the bigger question is, how can we get countries to increase their standards? In the Paris Agreement, they all agreed that every 5 years they would do new nationally determined contributions, so that there'd be with ever increasing levels of ambition. So those so that exists right now, but many nonprofits have think tanks have taken the view that better would be to, or in addition would be to create a carbon budget for the planet and divide it up equitably, and that becomes the target of your country. And there's many different, if you can imagine, details in working that out equitably, and taking into account historical emissions that have allowed your country to develop to the extent that you're using so much carbon right now. And that's controversial. There's all kinds of things to be worked out, but that's what I'm going to Glasgow really listening for, more about mechanisms that have been proposed, ones that are in place, and ones that are useful in other international agreements.
Thanks, Christine. I think we just have two or more questions before we wrap up and go into the next segment. And perhaps this question has partially been answered by you with your last answer. It's from Rose Dyson. On the issue of verification, most countries are coming up with some kind of framework, like a Climate Accountability Act. Is anyone at the UN checking on the progress with implementation to meet established targets?
Yeah, I think I pretty much answered that. I wouldn't have anything more unless,
Yeah.
Rose, there's some kind of specific thing. No. Yeah.
Okay, the last question then will be from Fergus. What are the future plans for the Better Climate Governance Project?
Short term, it's the advocacy on this thing. Our funding has long run out. I'm totally in the volunteer zone on this now. But my next steps are being ever more effective on advocacy on these ideas, and learning more about. I still can't believe they haven't been suggested before, and so who else is advocating for them, and making links with those other organizations that also think that this is important. So that's moving on our current recommendations. And then we've been approached by an African country, I'll just say an African country, that wanted help with their improve the impact of their team at these negotiations. And I wasn't sure what we might have to offer, but we had a meeting with the head of their negotiating team, and there were a number of things that were that they were interested in, and one was an academic program at their national university, and Catherine, my colleague, is now in conversation with him about what that might look like around climate negotiation effectiveness. And also I will maybe doing a couple of workshops with their whole team to identify the kind of impact they'd like to have, where they see themselves now, and what they can learn from other successful countries in that negotiation, in to move from where they are now to where they'd like to be in terms of impact at the negotiations. And I described that as a possible workshop, and he was very interested in it. So I think we're going to be maybe moving on that in the new year. And that's, yeah, I think that's the main things. And also, just one thing just leads to another. The more the consensus was not as big a thing. It was just one of 10 points. And now I have a whole separate network of people that I'm talking to about that. And so things there may be further obvious things that develop for us to do.
Thank you, Christine.
Well, Canada has a rather bad record of making promises to cut emissions and, setting targets and never meeting the target. And I wonder how many other countries are in a similar position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't answer that question, but they're not alone for sure.
Thanks, Christine. This has been a really good presentation. Thank you very much. And very fact we've gone 20 minutes past the hour, I think speaks for itself. Walter, would you like, Fergus, would you like to add anything? Fergus, Walter.
Sure. No, I think this has been great, and there's I mean, two interesting additions to some of the answers that Christine provided. I mean, one of the in terms of how we got the Paris Agreement in 2015, another driving factor was, in addition to all the preparatory work that France did, was the failure in Copenhagen just a few years earlier. And that was an effort for a treaty that would be more binding, that would have some mechanisms that would enforce greater compliance. And it was that failure that led to the recognition, I guess, of the world as we find it, or however you want to put it, but that we're going to have to just let states determine their own nationally determined contributions, for better or worse, and as a starting assumption, and I think it's still it's still a controversial aspect of how the system works. In the work I'm doing on the follow-up to the UN 75 declaration and the negotiations that are going to follow now, there's been a Secretary General's report that has like 90 proposals for strengthening global governance, but some of the interesting ones that pertain to climate. I mean, he's reviving the idea of framing climate as a global public good, and using common heritage language and so on. Where that's going to go, nobody can say, but because his report was just launched in September. But it's an interesting development. I mean, the norms around how we discuss the atmosphere. He says the atmosphere is part of our common heritage. There are four common heritage areas. There's the oceans, Antarctic, outer space, and he lumps the atmosphere in there. And that was how scientists used to think about it in the 80s. And then there was a pushback from a lot of countries, not just Saudi Arabia, others. And that's why we ended up with this weak framework agreement on the framework agreement on climate change. But if we'd had, because the law of the sea treaty is more binding. It has an adjudicative process, and that governs our use of the oceans. And I mean, it's in need of renovation as well, but at least the legal scaffolding is a little better in that respect. So it's still I'm digressing from, as Christine said, her remit is the negotiation processes, but there's I think still a lot of fluidity, and it's I think it's good that World Federalists are more engaged than we have been in the past, and it's thanks to Christine that to a great extent that we are more engaged on some of these issues, and hopefully the organization might might do more, even more in the future. But I agree, Norbert. This was a good talk, and you know, the problem with these big complex issues is you just scratch the surface in an hour and a half. But hey, it was fun.
Thanks, Fergus, and thanks again, Christine. We'll now move to the next segment. I hope you all enjoyed today's talk, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. If you have any suggestions for future speakers in our series, please send in your suggestions. John was going to put a link to a form where you can submit your suggestions. Please save that link, and if you have an opportunity to send in your suggestions. On January 12th, 2022, Peter Benton will be leading a discussion on ideas put forth by Elizabeth May when she addressed World Federalists on May 15th this year. All are welcome. We will send out an invitation closer to January 12th. Finally, the World Federalist Movement Toronto branch is seeking volunteers. If you would like to help, please email wfmc-toronto.org. And again, John will put that link in the chat. So we will now commence the second section of today's event with a discussion on World Federalism and World Federalist Movement. For anyone who is unable to stay on to learn more about World Federalism or to become a member, please visit www.wfmc-toronto.org. The cost of membership in the WFMC is $60 per individual, and it's reduced to $15 for students and others with limited income. So John will be putting all those links in the chat. Please save them. Now, to talk about World Federalism and the World Federalist Movement, we have Alex McIsaac, who is our new executive director, replacing Fergus Watt, and Walter Dorn. Over to you guys.
Okay, thank you, Norbert, for this wonderful event that the Toronto branch has organized. We certainly wish Christine all the best as she goes to the COP 26, I believe, in Glasgow, Scotland. And I think it's delightful that we have a project working on climate change. It's so important for our world and also important for the use of today. I always think we need mediators. We need people who can make new suggestions. We need to work with countries that are progressive. And we need to really push those countries that are laggards on climate to be able to go forward. And that's the beauty and the freedom of the NGO world that we can push. Well, Christine has given us a better understanding of climate change initiatives, the global initiatives. And I would overall characterize what she's told us about the work at the international level by the states as important but insufficient to solve the problem. And this same could be said for the major problems that are global of the world today, not just climate change. Pandemics, or accidental nuclear war, or release of nuclear weapons, or human rights, or peace and security more generally in our troubled planet. What we really need is better global governance. Just as Christine's initiative is better climate governance, so the world needs better global governance. And that's what we believe in the World Federalist Movement, is that there is hope and there is reason to believe that humanity can do better. We had an evolution of international organization 100 years ago. The first international organization for peace and for understanding global problems was created in the League of Nations. It only lasted a quarter century. And then a new organization had to be created, the United Nations. And the UN has lasted 3/4 of a century, but it's still insufficient to deal with these problems, as we see from the climate change issues. So as World Federalists, we think that we have to build upon the United Nations, make it a stronger organization, and even think about a third generation international organization. What would that look like? How can we create international law that's verifiable and enforceable? How can we create the mechanisms that go beyond the individual state and that apply to the individual person, so that we have individuals accountable for their actions and can be held up before tribunals and before courts, not just for the worst crimes, which is covered by the International Criminal Court, but for a broader set of crimes, even going to corruption, so that we can hold companies accountable at some international level. As World Federalists, we recognize that there is a lot of problems that have to be solved at a municipal level and a provincial level and a national level, but there's also those ungoverned spaces so far, the commons, as Fergus has called them, the global commons, that really need a form of global governance. And we haven't, as a species, as humanity, created those mechanisms that can really solve these problems. And that's why in world federalism, we have so much fascinating areas to explore, so many new ideas to think about how to create a better world. And in our initiative, we've seen a passing of the torch in Canada from Fergus Watt now to Alex McIsaac. And I'm very pleased that this is the first time in public that we can welcome Alex as the new executive director, while deeply thanking Fergus for his service of some 38 years working with the movement, and 35, I think, as executive director, and to his continuing service leading our campaign for the UN We Need. And so we really give a warm applause of gratitude to Fergus and a warm applause of welcome to Alex. And we welcome him to share his thoughts about world federalism and about some of his visions for the future, and a little bit about the work ahead of us, which I think as a result of this meeting will involve more climate change. But over to you, Alex.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Walter. And also thank you, Christine, for the great talk, and for the Toronto branch for organizing this event. It's an honor really to act as the new executive director of WFMC. Just a bit about myself. I grew up in kind of an international context. So when I was 3 years old, I was literally 3 years old on the plane. We moved to Nepal as a family, and from there on out, it was just going to another, like one community to another, and these communities were always in need of assistance from international development organizations. So what I was surrounded with growing up was always communities in crises, and I always thought why do, or how is considered what the differences were. It really helped shape my view, because I realized, at a certain point, the only difference between me and, my friends at school and everything who, didn't have the opportunity to leave the country when the civil war got bad in Nepal, or when, there were nuclear threats against India, even like something that's not considered as serious or as much as a threat by most people. It is an imminent threat, nuclear war, right? So yeah, those really helped shape my view, and I really realized that the only difference was my passport, right? That was the difference between me and my friends. And I stay in touch with some of them, and some of them, they still live in these communities, which now have Facebook, but they are affected by, still affected by those disasters. Then I went to university, and I didn't really have the term world federalism in mind, but I always had that view. And what I noticed in my studies, and this is where I get into kind of my view on world federalism, is there are so many issues, when it comes to international law or international bodies, that, the big thing that's stopping them from acting is the lack of hard power, right? It's just based on the agreements between states. And you'll see this, whatever the topic is, whether it's nuclear non-proliferation or disarmament, whether it's environmental treaties or regulations, right? You'll just have these countries that just back out, and you'll only have countries that actually support it, which will proceed with the project. So I see really 5 pillars to world federalism, or 5 main topics. We have global democracy, peace and security, global economy, which should be equitable, stable, just in a way. And we also have human rights justice, which, revolves around the International Criminal Court and other proceedings like that. And last but not least, of course, we have the environment, which is, of course, one of the biggest challenges that we face, as human beings nowadays. And yeah, some of these challenges I had trouble, when I was, doing my undergrad and master's, trying to like grasp the optimism that some people had in, the multilateral approach or the status quo approach, right? And what that meant in a way is that I transitioned towards world federalism, started looking up articles, and as soon as I found the name for that, I created my own little student organization called the Global Federal Association. And fast forward a few years and I'm here. But yeah, I've always had this vision actually, and it's something that world federalists get criticized a lot of. And it's that we're seen as too idealistic, right? I see it the other way around though. I wouldn't really agree with a person that would call us idealistic. I would think that it's more idealistic to actually, cross both your arms and do nothing and just hope that the status quo fix things. I think that we keep on renewing these targets, creating new sustainable development goals, millennium development goals, and carbon emissions is a big one where we just cannot reach our targets, right? And so I think that even though it is a big project, world federalism, and we need to build all these pillars, around that, the environment, security, human rights law, around all of these, they also need to be underpinned by democratic and fair processes. And it's a big project that we're undertaking as world federalists, and I'm really happy to be on board with it, and a part of this whole movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Walter. The floor is now open to questions. Please put your questions in the chat. And meanwhile, I have a question to either Walter or Alex. How much of a problem do you see that the different forms of government that we have, like the Arab countries having monarchies, China with their authoritarian government, how much are those a challenge to a world federation?
Yeah,
sure.
it's very, very
Go ahead,
practical.
Walter.
I'll have first stab at that one, Alex, and then I'll pass it on to you for words of elaboration and insight. It's definitely true that those power centers that hoard their power will be less willing to distribute them. But if we want to stop future Stalins, future Maos, future dictators that can run their fiefdoms and kill millions of people of their own population, we have to create these international mechanisms to make them accountable. And I think that the International Criminal Court is a start. And when it did start, when it tried to deal with some cases involving the United States, like investigations in Afghanistan, then it runs into challenges, but all the more important that it be supported. That the evolution of human history is the story of a principle fighting against power and principle gaining momentum. There was a time when countries said there's no way that you could possibly stop the practices of the day, whether it be slavery or dueling or divine right of kings, and those slave owners and those kings held the power, but eventually they had to give in to reasoning. And so we still have to push for worldwide democracy. And I do believe that democracy can exist on a global level. That's a rudimentary sense of democracy as consent of the governed, even with radically different systems of national governance. So that we have that already in primordial fashion in the United Nations with one country, one vote in the General Assembly, and then some 10 rotating members in the Security Council, along with 5 permanent members, which is really a vestige of World War II power structures at the end of World War II. So those things have to be changed over time. And if humanity doesn't change out of wisdom, then it will change out of shock. That's the way that human history evolves. It took First World War to create the League, Second World War to create the UN, and hopefully we won't need another World War to create a better organization. That we can gradually make slow progress and strengthen the United Nations and make it into an organization that really is worthy of being called IO 3.0. That is International Organization 3.0, and that we can make benefits from these steps like the global challenges of climate change. And as the temperature heats up on this planet, as carbon dioxides continue that rise, there's going to be more and more incentive. So there'll be more and more pressure at all levels. And we should be at the forefront of that, making sure that we have binding international agreements that are verifiable and enforceable. And in the end, I agree with Alex that the idealist is the person who thinks they can just fold their hands and the world will be okay. Whereas the realist is the one who says we have to change unless or we'll suffer perdition. There are existential threats to our planet today, and global governance is needed. As we often say as World Federalists, global problems require global solutions, and a global solution means global governance. Where do you, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's funny how you mentioned institutional inertia, right? How international structures actually change, and we often forget about these things, right? And often it does come as a shock more than anything, just because of that inertia that's built in, right? So it's very unlikely that one of the permanent members of the Security Council, for example, would relinquish their power or open up the membership to new people even, right? They definitely would never let go of their veto. And that's a part of why we see these big waves in terms of like values going up. And we have a lot of global values now roaming around. And it's just a matter of the institutions catching up at a certain point. And if that gap just keeps increasing, then, change is almost inevitable at that point. Also, just go back to, the original point, with world federalism, it doesn't really matter what the structure of the nation is, the structure that is, right? Of course, the actions matter and the treatment of people within that nation matter. But the principles of world federalism would apply to all nations alike, regardless of whether they're separated by provinces, states, or even municipalities within that.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Walter. Folks, please put your question in the chat or raise your hand so that you could ask the questions directly. In the meantime, I've got a question for Walter and Alex, and it has to do with the United Nations Parliamentary Association. For those who may not know what it is, can you briefly explain what it is? At the WFMC's association with it, or what we do in support of it, and how we see that perhaps transforming the future of the United Nations if it comes into place.
Sure. The UN Parliamentary Assembly, or UNPA, can be envisioned in different fashions. One would be that you have ideally direct elections to a UN Parliament, similar to the European Parliament. But that's very unlikely now. And as we discussed just moments ago about problem countries like China and Russia, which don't allow real democracy, it'd be hard to envisage real elections happening in those countries. Yet we can envisage that parliamentarians, sitting members of parliaments of different countries, could get together, for instance, in the General Assembly Hall, and meet and pass some resolutions. And over time, we can see an evolution of that, because they represent the legislative branches of government in countries around the world. And if the legislatures were to elect their representatives to the UN Parliamentary Assembly, then it would be a different mechanism, and it would see the beginning of the checks and balances that will be needed for global governance at an international level. Just as we come to expect human rights and equality before the law on our national level here in Canada and in democracies, we can demand that at the international level, and that will require checks and balances at the international level. As the international organization gets more power, then it will be all the more important that you have the judicial branches, which could be the International Court of Justice, which is reviewing decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly and the UN Parliamentary Assembly. You could have the Parliamentary Assembly, which would be a different composition, even having some resolutions which are in contradiction to the votes in the General Assembly or the Security Council. And this kind of tussle at the international level would be a healthy thing, and it would help to introduce the checks and balances as more power is given. We'd like to see standing peace forces, and we need those to be under some sort of check and balance, so that a Secretary General would have to be held accountable. So in many ways, there's a need for a new body at the UN, and it ideally would come about through charter amendment, but since the veto holders have a veto over changing the veto, and we're not expecting to see charter amendment, which would require which would be required for creating a new body with the full legislative powers. But we can see that you could have subsidiary bodies created, and that a subsidiary body of the General Assembly could be created as a primordial UNPA, where there would be meetings once a year or several times around certain issues of parliamentarians from around the world. I myself have organized meetings of parliamentarians from around the world. I organized one at the French Parliament at the time of the signing of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And I know that the power that comes when you have members of parliaments from around the world coming together and looking at their common role. And it's different from when you have the diplomats and the representatives of the executive branches.
Thanks, Walter. Alex, or even Fergus, do you have anything to add?
I had a couple of points to add. I couldn't really add to the content without going on a ramble. That was really capturing everything about the UNPA. As Walter mentioned, it is not a definitive structure that it's being proposing. It's not saying per se this is the amount of seats, this is the way, or these are the rules of procedure of how it's going to be organized. World federalism is all this idea, and it's engaging in those deliberations of what is the UNPA to you that is so interesting about this organization, right? I will, however, note, I sent a link in the chat. We do have a participation with a campaign for UNPA, so UN Parliamentary Assembly. And in addition to that, we do have it is the Week for World Parliament that is coming up near the end of October. We will be posting that on the main website, and there is an open letter for a World Parliament that you can all sign. I'm also going to drop that in the chat.
Thanks, Alex. Fergus, do you want to add anything, or are we good? Okay.
No, I'm good, Norbert.
Thanks, Fergus. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put that in the chat or even speak up.
Okay, I would like to hear more about how a parliamentary assembly would work in terms of representatives from different countries. I think, Walter, you said something about a direct election of somebody from each country that would form this assembly. How would those people interact or interface with, for example, our prime minister that goes to address the assembly from time to time, or somebody like, I think, who is it? Bob Rae, who is now the representative from Canada to the end. I mean, what role would these people have alongside a parliamentary assembly, if any?
Right. So if we look at the levels of governance, this would be very similar to a legislator relating to the executive branch. So if you have a representative of the legislature speaking at the UN, then they would have carry with them the weight of the legislature, and that would be the legislator that is from their home countries. And similarly, when the European Parliament meets, they are different but working together with the European Commission, the more executive branch of the European Union. And so there would be obvious tensions, but also direction, and there would need to be some sort of passing eventually of a budget. So the budget would go through a legislative process. The direct election is far away. I mean, I foresee that we'll have some sort of forms of world referenda in coming years or decades, where we'll try and get most of the world to have a vote about something. And with online mechanisms increasing, and we're getting vast swaths of territory being open to internet, then we can actually hope to have some form of very preliminary form of world census or world voting. But eventually we'll have a direct election. But before that, you'd simply have the members of parliament in each parliament voting for their representatives to UNPA. And then they would go and there would be a lot of harmony between the executive and the legislative branch, just as there is in many countries, but also a lot of tensions too. So I think that you find that on many issues, the legislative representative and the executive representative would be saying the same thing, but on some issues they would be saying different things depending on the nature of the executive and legislative branches back at home.
Thanks, Walter.
Thanks.
There's a good question from James Mitchell, and I think this is a question that most people who stumble into world federalism ask, given the nature of the world today. And the question is, how realistic is world federalism in a time of local populism?
Well, I'll start on that one again. So populism is a word that I find doesn't represent what it means. I call it demagoguery. So these are demagogues, whether you talk about Vladimir Putin or Hugo Chavez or Xi Jinping, and they don't allow for real opposition. And so it's back to that same old question of those in power won't want to give them up. But as the pressure cooker starts increasing more pressure, everyone is going to be realizing that we'll need to create new mechanisms of global governance. And so there will be some countries which will be in advance, more open to sending people to a UN Parliamentary Assembly and to global governance. And then there will be the demagogues or the so-called populists, which will be hiding behind some forms of minimal democracy or shadow democracies that are not real democracies. And so we'll have to deal with those. But eventually, I would like to see that the demagogues who are committing crimes against humanity are actually arrested and put behind bars, because they'll have their time in trial. But when it comes up to a judgment by the international standards, then they won't be able to continue to rule. But it's, we in world federalism have the luxury of thinking decades and centuries into the future. And because we think global in terms of dimension, that is space, we can also think for the long term in time as well.
Thanks, Walter. Alex, I'm going to ask you to respond to the same question as a person from the younger generation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny you asked that, because I actually wrote my thesis proposal on, the relationship between national populists rising, changes in globalization. So I really see a direct link between, increasing globalization, increasing nationalist populism, which comes, in three forms of trying to, strangle the process of integration between nations, right? So they try to strangle that through cutting migration, so immigration laws. They try to prevent capital movements across borders, and they also try to prevent trade. So those are the three big economic choke points that populists attack, right? And you'll see that with a lot of these populists like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban, and these movements, the funny part is, they cause a lot of destruction, and, there's maybe nothing funny about that because it, causes a lot of hardship around the world, and it does destroy a lot of progress that we make on international institutions. But just to tie that back to the other point, there's a silver lining there is when these populists like, Donald Trump, who, just draw back from everything international related, right? Saying, oh, we need America first or something like that. What they don't realize is they're destroying the exact international structure, which is caught in institutional inertia and is acting to the benefit of a lot of these countries subtly. So the values, the international values, international ideas, international norms that are all around us have definitely, made a lot of progress, a lot more progress than we've seen in the changes in structure since 1945. And you can see that by the explosion in the amount of, not-for-profits and international organizations. And these organizations are just, and ideas really are waiting to be institutionalized as soon as, there's a need for it. And there will always be a need for it. The world was very globalized actually, and we tend to forget that near the end of the 18th century and end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, right before, the explosion of populism that led to World Wars I and II, actually. So that's actually when you see change occur, and the destruction of, the United Nations or the League of Nations, sorry, gave way to the United Nations, and it gave a clean slate through which people's ideas and developing international norms could come to fruition. And I believe that, of course, it is very disheartening to see a lot of populist movements or national populists. The ideal would be to just have like cordial discussions and get to agreements on how to change these structures. But sometimes that's what's necessary, right? You need a bit of destruction to have something new come about.
Thanks, Alex. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, we shall then wrap this meeting up. It's almost 9, just in time. So on behalf of myself and the Toronto Board of Directors, I thank every one of you for joining and participating in today's event, especially Christine for the presentation, Dr. Walter Dorn and Fergus for the introductions, John Cohen, sorry, I should add Alex as well for the contributions, John Cohen, Peter Benton, Rose Dyson for their behind-the-scenes work leading up to and during this presentation. The Toronto branch is here to serve our members. Currently, we do this by arranging talks such as this, and also our bi-monthly members meeting, where members get together to work on furthering the World Federalist cause. If you are not a member and believe that the only solution to global problems such as climate and war is through a federated world government, the same system of government we have in Canada, comprising of a municipal layer, a provincial layer, and a national layer, except for the addition of a missing global layer, please consider joining the movement. You can register or become a member at https://www.wfmcanada.org/donate. And John, if you could please put that in the chat. And I look forward to seeing you all on January 12th. Good night, everybody.